For most of us, Halo is the story of overcoming the impossible. Characters like the Master Chief, the crew of the Spirit of Fire, and even the ODSTs of Alpha 9 have stood against seemingly unstoppable enemies time and time again. Enemies like the Covenant, the Banished, or even the Endless, whose failures ultimately help define them as heroes. But we often overlook the background characters, the ones who barely even register to the protagonist. And no one embodies that sentiment more than Zuka Zamamee, a Covenant officer who's failed not once, not twice, but on 3 separate occasions to kill the Master Chief. And despite his best efforts, this otherwise impossible task ended up costing him his reputation, his comrades, and ultimately, his life. I will clarify that his story is not necessarily explored within the game's campaign, as he is actually pulled from the pages of Halo the Flood, though this is a novelization of the events which occur on Alpha Halo. And if you've been with me for a while, you might recall that I actually covered this story a few years ago, but with the release of Halo Campaign Evolved only days away at this point, there is no better time to revisit one of Halo's most tragic characters, especially if you're new to the franchise. And due in part to your incredible support, I now have a beast of a computer, which means I now have access to mods. So today I'll be using visuals taken from DrkSteel's Zuka Zamamee campaign mod, and I'll mention too that if you haven't already thought about it, given this story is directly tied to the main story notes from the game, Halo CE or Halo Campaign Evolved, there's definitely going to be some spoilers in this video, so be sure to click away if you don't want anything spoiled. But if you're ready to go, let's count down these final hours until Campaign Evolved releases and dive into the tragic tale of Zuka Zamamee. During the final hours of the Covenant's invasion of Reach in August of 2552, the UNSC Pillar of Autumn would make a blind slipspace jump to an otherwise unknown location. And after 20 days in slipspace, the Autumn would emerge into the Soel system, home to the gas giant Threshold, which was being orbited by a massive ring-like megastructure known as Installation 04, or later designated as Alpha Halo. Yet the wonder of this ring was cut short, as their vessel had been followed by Supreme Commander Velvatomee and his fleet of particular justice, with their forces having arrived days before them due to their far more advanced slipspace technology. Having used this time to prepare an ambush, Covenant craft were quickly deployed to engage. And among these boarding parties would be Special Operations Officer Zuka Zamamee, a key individual leading the raid on the ship. After breaking through the ship's hull, Zamamee and other Covenant troops were met with heavy resistance from the UNSC, and in addition to the Autumn taking on heavy damage, the ship and its crew were quickly overwhelmed. But completely unaware that the ship was also carrying a Spartan who had just been flash-thawed, Zamamee and the troops under his command were blindsided by the Master Chief, with Zamamee himself suffering a near-fatal shot to the head. Although this was not the end of his story, as he had survived the injury but was rendered unconscious. Luckily for him, though, his groans of pain would alert a passing unit of Envoy, led by those known as Yayap and Gagor. Upon the discovery of this wounded officer, the two debated on what to do, but after realizing his rescue might allow them to escape the battle unharmed, they seized the opportunity, then fleeing the ship with Zamamee in tow. Shortly after recovering from his injury, Zamamee realized the loss of his Envoy assistant as they had perished during the attack. But impressed with the quick thinking and dedication to the safety of a superior officer, informed Yayap that he would take their place. The two then began scheming as to how they would hunt down this demon and restore his honor. But first, Zamamee would need to meet with the Council of Masters aboard the Truth and Reconciliation, informing them of the dangers of this Spartan to prevent further catastrophe. However, when he did this, his requests fell on deaf ears, as they had felt his fears were merely a symptom of battle-induced hysteria. But his concerns would be realized when the ship fell under attack by human forces. Not long after beginning their attack, the Master Chief had eliminated an alarming number of troops, freed a handful of prisoners, including the Pillar of Autumn's captain, Jacob Keyes, and even hijacked one of their Spirit dropships. So, with a newfound understanding of the severity of the situation, Zamamee was recalled and given permission to re-engage the demon. Believing that the Covenant BattleNet had been compromised, which was indeed true, Zamamee sought to use this to his advantage and would lay a trap. Purposefully leaving several references to a Forerunner map room or a cartographer, he believed that the humans would designate this as their next target and deploy the Spartan to investigate. And not long after leaving these proverbial breadcrumbs, the UNSC would take the bait, staging an assault on the island housing the structure. And as the Master Chief began to push his way down the beach, Zamamee would eagerly await for his chance to strike alongside a pair of Megalagolo and a lance of Ungoi, commanded by Yayap. At first, everything was going to plan. The humans had broken through the beachhead, the Spartan had entered the main structure, and he was on his way to the security center where Zamamee was waiting. But just as they began their ambush, one of the hunters would carelessly charge past the officer, knocking him to the floor. And only moments later, one of the Ungoi would accidentally fire an overcharged plasma pistol into the back of the other hunter, killing it instantly. The situation deteriorated immediately, and the confusion allowed the Master Chief to gain the upper hand, allowing him to easily dispatch the remaining hunter and the rest of the Lance. Fearing that they would be next, Yap and Zamamee immediately fled the encounter, only having survived by hiding inside of a nearby cargo pod. Then, once the dust had settled and the Master Chief had moved on, the two would eventually escape the island and return to the Council in failure. But rather than immediately ending his life, Zamamee was given one final chance by the Prophet of Stewardship. And to emphasize the consequences of yet another failure, he was presented with the decapitated head of Soha Rolami, who had been charged with the containment of the flood down on the Halo, but had ultimately failed. It was then reiterated that should he fail again, he would suffer the same fate. In his next attempt, Zamamee believed his best chance to eliminate the Master Chief would be to catch him off guard, and rather than targeting the Spartan himself, this time they would stage a scene with a destroyed Ghost and a stranded pilot, purposefully allowing them to be found and captured by human forces so that they would take him to their base of operations, with that being Alpha Base. That way the individual would be able to signal once the Master Chief was present, utilizing a beacon found within their armor. And with such an important task, Zamamee felt that Yap was the only one who he could trust. But in order to make the scene more believable, Yap was beaten and then thrown into the debris. Eventually, he was discovered by patrolling UNSC forces and brought back to Alpha Base, and after patiently waiting for any indication of the demon's presence, he would learn that the Master Chief had returned. He then immediately signaled to Zamamee and his message would be received, but their deployment would end up taking much longer than anticipated. Utilizing a hijacked Pelican that Covenant troops had recovered from an earlier battle, Zamamee would force a captured UNSC pilot to fake a transmission, requesting clearance to land so that he and a few dozen other Special Operations Sangheili could infiltrate the base. And once on the ground, the majority would work to secure as many landing pads as possible for further reinforcements, while he and a small team would work their way through the base and locate the Master Chief. Having killed nearly every human in their path, the team was ultimately unsuccessful in finding their target. However, they were able to locate and free Yap. Zamamee then instructed the Grunt to point them in the direction of the Spartan, but fearing that the assault was going to fail, he was able to convince the officer that the Master Chief was off-guarding a collection of stolen Banshees, which Zamamee completely believed. On their way to the Banshees, they were met with heavy resistance, resulting in the deaths of the entire squad except for Zamamee and Yap. Yet, despite their sacrifice, Master Chief was nowhere to be seen, because, in reality, John 117 was currently occupied with the Flood elsewhere on the ring. Putting two and two together, Zamamee realized that he had been tricked, and when he turned to punish the Ungoi for his deceit, Yap was now holding him at gunpoint. He then threatened the elite to climb inside the Banshee and fly them away from the base. Realizing that their assault was quickly falling apart, Zamamee couldn't find a reason to argue, and complied. With there being absolutely no way that he could return to the Council empty-handed yet again, Yap suggested that Zamamee avoid punishment by traveling to the crash site of the Pillar of Autumn, where Covenant forces had established a new base of operations. Because in the wake of several engagements, there would be many soldiers who had died, and all he would need to do to blend in is assume the identity of one of them. He agreed that this would be the best course of action and took on the identity of a Huki Umami, one of the many commandos who had served under him during their assault on Alpha Base. Upon arriving, he would make his way to the head of operations at the crash site, simply known as Ontami. Being overworked and severely understaffed, he was more than pleased to have a Special Operations Officer under his command, and asking no questions, granted him the immediate charge of 20 Kigyar troops. Though this was short-lived, as only one day later, Ontami would gather the troops to announce that the Master Chief had arrived at the human vessel. Without hesitation, Zamamee jumped at the opportunity, vowing to hunt down the demon himself. Ontami granted his request and let him know that he would have access to whatever he needed. And unlike previous attempts, this time Zamamee would be laying in wait, while Yap tracked the Spartan's real-time location. Sometime later, John 117 would undermine the efforts of the Ring's monitor to stop a self-destruct sequence and trigger a catastrophic reactor meltdown. And as he began working his way towards his extraction point, Yap had determined the perfect location for their ambush would take place aboard an elevator connected to a Warthog service bay. So, armed with a shade turret and several heavily armed troops, he awaited eagerly. It was not long before he was finally face to face with the Master Chief once again, and this time he was actually successful in firing off a few plasma bolts. But he missed him entirely. And before he could adjust, the Spartan's artificial intelligence disabled the elevator and sent it hurtling to the bottom of the shaft. And immediately after, the Master Chief tossed 2 fragmentation grenades in his direction. The resulting explosion would send Zamamee flying into the wall, breaking his spine, paralyzing him. And almost without even acknowledging him, the Spartan continued on. But as Zamamee laid there dying, he felt a sense of clarity, acknowledging that yes, he did ultimately fail his mission, but at least he would die in combat. And even though his target had bested him on several occasions and he barely even registered to him, at least he would die at the hands of such a legendary warrior. So, taking his last breath, he was at peace. And it wasn't long before the Pillar of Autumn's reactor blew, and he drifted away to paradise. And that, my friends, was the tragic tale of Zuka Zamamee, a Sangheili warrior who lost it all while trying to get the upper hand on one of the most unkillable characters in gaming. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, his character is pulled from the pages of Halo the Flood, so you won't necessarily see or hear him mentioned throughout Campaign Evolved's campaign. Or maybe you will, as the remake has made several changes to encounters and their enemies, so it's entirely possible that we'll see a Spec Ops Elite pop up during some of these ambushes, or maybe we'll see some additional audio to help incorporate him in some way. Whatever the case, I hope that knowing more about Zuka Zamamee gives you a little bit of a different perspective while you play through the campaign, and maybe you'll look at some of these encounters differently. And hey, if you enjoyed today's video, please be sure to drop me a like, hype the video, or subscribe if you're new, and want to stay up to date on all of the new lore, games, and developments with Halo. Now, I was not lucky enough to get an early review copy of Campaign Evolved, so it's going to be a few days before I can actually work on some videos, but the current plan is to do a deep dive into the prequel missions, the Sacristan Order, a full game review, and then an updated story summary for the game with new cinematics and gameplay. But if there is anything else that you guys would like me to cover, please leave me a comment with your suggestions or any other lore questions that you might have. But that is all for today, so I'll see you in the next video.